War must be, while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. All right, as I read that quote, I could almost feel across the nation and the world thousands upon thousands of Tolkien bros rising up, swords in hand, ready to cheer because they think I'm about to do a Lord of the Rings episode. I'm so sorry to disappoint you and get your hopes up. I am not going to do a Lord of the Rings episode right now. I know I need to do some Tolkien episodes. I intend to. It's going to happen. But actually, I want to use that quote, which is from Faramir in The Two Towers, for a slightly different purpose today. Side note, my dad read me The Lord of the Rings, the written trilogy, aloud when I can't remember, I must have been like in middle school. And the confession that I have to make to you is that I fell asleep a lot during those books. And so I've always kind of had a antsy and uncomfortable relationship to them because I loved the movies when they came out, and I was like, suddenly I see what everyone is talking about. Lord of the Rings is amazing. And I was like, so why were there all those long scenes of like the descriptions of the trees, so many forests? And I actually kind of for a long time thought, the movies are better. Like, this is one of the rare cases where Peter Jackson actually synthesized and streamlined what was kind of an unruly piece of work. And I felt really bad about that because a lot of people I really like and respect just love those books. I am a huge Inklings fan generally. I like Tolkien's nonfiction. Obviously, C.S. Lewis is one of my heroes. And so I never quite knew what to make of it. And I just decided finally this year I'm going to go back and reread them because I must have missed something. And every time I watch the movies, which I do all the time, again and again, I feel like they're so good. The source material must be better than I remember it, less flabby, less boring. And lo and behold, I maybe it changes things that I'm listening to an audiobook, although I guess I listened to it the first time around too. I totally get it now, you guys. I am digging this second time around through the actual books of Lord of the Rings. Tom Holland, when I had him on the show, the historian whom I really admire, he was talking about his relationship as a kid to Herodotus, the father of history, the great Greek historian. And he said, when I was a kid, I used to think Herodotus goes on all these digressions and what's that about? And there are all these kind of side byways and places where he just randomly will up and just tell you some things he knows about the Egyptians. And, speaking of the Bithynians, did you know they have the custom? Whatever. And he said when he was a kid, he thought that was just really boring. He just wanted to get to the story of the Persian War, which is what the book is supposed to be about. But now, the older he gets, as he digs deeper into Herodotus and loves Herodotus more and more, he wishes there were more digressions. He wishes there were more byways, more back alleys and stuff to go on. And that's how I'm feeling now about Lord of the Rings. Like, I wish it were longer. I wish there were more scenes in the forest where they're just walking and talking. I wish we could encounter like 5 other parties of elves. And maybe this is because you have to have a vision of the whole and understand where the whole story is going before the byways make sense to you as part of the whole. I don't know. It was interesting to me that reaction which Tom had to Herodotus is exactly the reaction I'm having to Lord of the Rings. But either way, I definitely intend to do some Lord of the Rings episodes. I think there's so much in there to talk about. But I have to get through the reread first because there's a lot that I don't remember. Hopefully this year, maybe next year, we'll get to that. For now, though, I did just want to read that quote at the beginning because it actually plays directly into what I really want to talk about today, which is icons, the veneration of icons and the depictions of Christ and Mary and the saints that have been objects of veneration, but also points of steep contention throughout church history. I started to talk a little bit about icons on a recent episode when I was dealing with John the philosopher or John the mathematician, and I said that I was reading this book about the Byzantine Empire and that it had got me thinking about this concept of the world as an icon, which actually fits really nicely and kind of sums up a lot of the stuff that I've been saying this beginning of this year about the relationship between art and us and art and the world and what art exists to do. And I was a little surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been that surprised, that I got a lot of feedback about that. Like, people were really interested in it, and they said, yeah, this is the way to go. You've kind of hit on it. And so I thought, okay, fair enough. I thought that I was being super nerdy and doing a big deep cut by talking about this obscure Byzantine philosopher, but actually it turns out icon veneration and iconoclasm and iconophilia and this whole area of study and the theory, the philosophy of icons actually is something that people seem kind of interested in. And I'm definitely interested in it. Definitely want to talk more about it. I got two emails in particular, fascinatingly, one from a Catholic and one from an East Orthodox Christian. And I want to read from portions of those emails today, hopefully, if I have time, just because I think that's really fascinating that both of these supposedly schismatic churches, they're supposed to be at odds with each other, but they both agree about icons in a lot of particulars. Some differences, and those are interesting to explore too, but by and large, they have this they're agreed on this point, which is a point of major contention in many Protestant churches. And of course, the finery and the decor and the grandeur of churches and the Catholic machine and all of the veneration of icons and saints was a huge sticking point in the Reformation, and it remains a powder keg to this day. So never have I been more sincere when I say, don't at me. I am not here to tell you what you should be doing in church, but I do think that this is a really fascinating controversy that raises all sorts of important, urgent issues for us to be thinking about as we're dealing with morality and art in the present day. And that's part of why the controversies are still live, is that underneath them there are all these important questions. And as often as is usually the case, my take on these controversies is that actually they are part of a coherent whole. There is a wonderful depiction in the Stanza della Segnatura, which is a room in the Vatican where Raphael painted the School of Athens, and the whole room is covered in his work. And one of the paintings is this battle going on between theologians and priests, and I believe it's over the real presence that they're having this. He's depicting a particular historical fight that erupted over the nature of the Eucharist and whether that really is Christ's body and so on and so forth. And the priests in it are on two sides of the painting, and they've almost come to blows. It just almost looks like they are about to erupt into a brawl. And Raphael's really going for it with that. And then the top third or maybe even just quarter of the painting is the Trinity in the sky. It's the Father and the dove, the Holy Spirit, and so forth. And the Trinity extends across it all. And it's like God is presiding over the argument itself. And I think of that painting all the time, especially when I think about the letters of Paul and the letters of James in the Bible, and the way that there's this emphasis on faith over works in Paul, broadly speaking, and then there's this emphasis on works in James, that faith without works is dead. And you can represent this as a knockdown, drag-out fight, and in some sense, I think it really is. I think that these are two stark positions, and yet I think that the biblical truth that we get from that conversation is in the whole argument. It is in the history of that conflict and in the way that we ourselves can be led to a higher truth by attempting to reconcile these two points of view. And maybe it's impossible to build a perfect system that exactly articulates in nailed down human linguistic terms how these two things can be reconciled. It's kind of like when the Bible says justice and peace shall kiss. We think, well, peace is one thing, but justice sometimes requires fighting and war, and how can these two things come together? But we know in our hearts that there is a synthesis of them. It is possible, and we're always moving toward it, like these two lines that are converging at infinity. I think it's Charles Spurgeon who talks about parallel lines converging at infinity. And that's sort of the image that I always have with these fights, that what's really true is in the midst of the dispute, and that's what God is delivering, even through these incredibly contentious disputes and fights. And people get kind of head up about this because they want very much, and I'm guilty of this all the time, they want very much for their one position to be the absolute right one. But in many of these church controversies, even the ones that lead to schism, I sometimes feel that what we're actually looking at is two sides of one reality, and this is baked deep into the core of just how life works. It's not limited to the church that this sort of thing can happen. You've probably, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, heard me talk about hylomorphism, which is the union of matter and form. So the fact that, I mean, to give just a really simple example, if you have a bronze circle, a circle isn't bronze. It's a thing that is more than or beyond bronze. It's a shape that can also be in wood or clay or any number of other materials. And so the matter and the form are distinct in our minds, and we can see them as two different things, but there's no such thing as a circle that isn't made out of any matter, or at least we have no way even of picturing one. If you think about what's a circle without matter, what you'll really be doing is, in your head, you'll be drawing a black ink circle on a piece of white paper or something similar. So for us, at least, as embodied souls, form and matter are intertwined, and they have basically, they present as aspects of the same thing or some version of that, and figuring out the way to describe that is part of the debate that is going to ensue here over icons in just a second. But the point is that, you know, these two things are two, but they are essentially one in some fundamental way, and so often in life, we find ourselves in debates and disputes and arguments that are kind of like that one person will be insisting on it's faith, not works. Faith is primary. Another person was saying, yeah, but you have faith, but works are essential. They're like the matter. And the other person said, but faith is like the form. And the answer lies in that conversation, in insisting and holding on to those two truths at once. So that's, to me, why it is actually really worthwhile not just to take a position, quote unquote, on icons, but to learn about the issues at stake in the dispute and what people have said and argued over how this is supposed to work. So I'm going to do a little bit of talking about that today, and hopefully we'll talk more about it as we go, because it's a huge, huge subject that we've really just only opened up. It's not something we've done a lot of on Young Heretics, which is exciting. This will be fun. Whenever I start to think about icons, and I was like, I'm going to do an episode about the veneration of icons, and the only thing I can think of, I keep coming back to this Wendy Williams clip. Wendy Williams is a talk show host, and she mostly now is known as one of these incredibly memeable people. You know, some people have a punchable face, other people have a memeable face, and Wendy Williams has a memeable face and a memeable demeanor. She's this kind of shock jock personality, and you've probably seen her, even though you probably don't know her name. And she's got one clip that is just everywhere, where she says she's an icon, she's a legend, and she is the moment. And you can see this all over the place. She was talking about Lil' Kim, who sang Lady Marmalade, or that sort of thing. You've probably heard some of her songs. She's, you know, pop star from the 90s, early 2000s. So I like to think of this as the sayings of Lady Marmalade, book 5. Subheading 2, she's an icon, she's a legend, and she is the moment. So you'll have to tell me whether you think this episode was as iconic as Lil' Kim. But actually, I have something vaguely interesting to say about that use of the word icon, which is the one we're maybe most familiar with in modern discourse. When people say he's an icon or it's iconic, we all know what that means. It means that it's so well known and so even beloved or fixated upon that it's become a symbol of something. And now, the way that words tend to decay when they become popular slang, it basically just means she's amazing, right? She's an icon. She's unbelievable. Madonna is an icon. Taylor Swift, whom we were talking about a moment ago, is an icon. And that is pretty distant in many ways from the original Greek word eikon. But one of the wonderful things about language, one of my favorite things about how words work, is that they contain in them traces, vestiges of their past. And the original light of the metaphor kind of fades but never goes away entirely. And so language becomes this graveyard of dead metaphor. And if you uncover that metaphor, you will find that there is a kind of spirit of the word that is moving even through its modern usage. And this is really a subject for a whole separate podcast, and we should probably talk about that too. But in this case, with icon, with the word icon, we actually have something important and interesting to note here. When you say that Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce are iconic, you are actually saying something more than just they're really, really famous. You're not just saying that, and there's a reason why you say iconic instead of famous, and it's because you think of them as emblematic. And maybe that's not as explicit, and you couldn't say what they're emblematic of exactly. But then if you examine, you'll realize, yeah, they're emblematic of a certain American spirit or moment or sentiment, and you may or may not actually like that sentiment. So usually we say icon, it's a term of praise, but now if we think more deeply about it, we'll realize that you can be iconic in a negative way. For some people, Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce are icons of a media industrial complex that is totally in hock to Joe Biden and the Democrat machine and even the regime, or she's a psyop and all of that. But she's still iconic. So even if you hate Taylor Swift, which I do not, just for the record, but just if that's your position, you still think she's iconic. And it's because she's iconic that she elicits such strong emotions in you. If she weren't an icon, you wouldn't hate her. You would just be indifferent to her, as she wouldn't matter to you as much. But because she is taken, rightly or wrongly, to represent a certain aspect of Americana or of our society right now, we can't help but react passionately toward her. And this is the next element of what it truly means to be an icon or to be iconic, is that the thing itself, the person who is Taylor Swift, or the music that she sings, or the games that Travis Kelce wins for the Chiefs, those specifics are not really what we're reacting to when we react to them and to these people and to their image and their presence in media. What we're really reacting to is what they represent. And so our emotional reaction to them is outsized because the thing that they stand in for is outsized, is more than themselves. And in point of fact, this is exactly what an icon is. The Greek word eikon, which I just mentioned, is where we get our word icon. And it just means an image, but it means an image in this specific philosophical sense that is going to become very important for ancient Greek epistemology and the aesthetics and the theory of sense perception, and persists to this day in the discussion that ensues over hundreds and hundreds of years about what icons are and whether we're supposed to venerate them. And at the outset, let me make a classic canonical distinction, because I've been using that word venerate on purpose. One of the accusations against Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox in certain branches of Protestantism, although not all, is that icon veneration amounts to idolatry. And actually, the Protestants were not the first people to come up with this objection. We picked it up, we Protestants did, from the long-standing debate over whether this just represents sliding back into the customs of the Gentiles, the ways of the peoples that the Jews were warned against, and whether it violates the commandment that thou shalt not make any graven images. And as part of the distinction between these two things, you get this distinction between the doulia and latreia, which are two different kinds of service or worship. Latreia is from a Greek word that connotes actual religious worship, that would have referred to rituals and ceremonies for worshiping the Greek gods. And the stated position of orthodoxy, small o, that is basically everybody can agree on this point, that latreia is due only to God himself and no one else. So God in the Trinity for Christians, and not, for example, to Mary. Doulia, which means something like servitude or service, is used in this context to mean something more like very high honor. And you might think here of a knight in the chivalric era pledging his fealty to a lady, to the high lady. And the highest lady of all is Mary. And that kind of dulia does not imply that the lady is your goddess. It just means that you are devoted to her and will die to protect her. And that sort of feeling, if you take that picture, that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about dulia, which is translated often as veneration. And so whether or not you think, and some people could make the argument that dulia very easily, and in fact too easily, bleeds and blends into latreia. That is, one accusation is you start out kneeling to Mary and pledging your service because of who she is as the mother of God. But then it's very, very easy, because the human heart is a factory of idols, it's very easy for that to just slip over into worshiping Mary and performing latreia, which is due only to God. You could make that argument, but in principle, as a matter of awareness of the debate here and what's being discussed, latreia and dulia are distinct things. You can conceive of them as different, even if in practice they might bleed into each other, and that bleeding would be a problem. Okay, having established that, I want to take you first of all to St. Thomas Aquinas, our old pal Thomas. We've read from the Summa Theologiae regularly on this podcast. It's a really helpful encyclopedia, basically, of questions about faith, and they're worked out with great philosophical rigor in what you might call an Aristotelian flavored mode. That is, Thomas is very, very respectful of Aristotle. He does obviously differ with him on certain points and amend him on certain points in a way that we might think of as baptizing Aristotle, or fulfilling or completing Aristotle. But that's kind of what you're getting when you get Aquinas, which is going to become important when we move to the East, because in the East, a lot of the time you get much more Platonic influence, Neoplatonic influence. So the Aristotle-Plato debate kind of reemerges in this East-West debate. But Aquinas and the Eastern theologians, whom we'll discuss, is agreed that you do actually venerate pictures of Christ, and you do actually venerate the cross. And in order to discuss why, in the third part of the Summa, in question 25, Aquinas begins, interestingly, by asking an older question, which is about the distinction between Christ's humanity and his Godhead. And this is a question that actually predates the question about icons. And so it's interesting and important that Aquinas begins there, because we go back to like Nicaea when we're talking about the debate over the nature of Christ, and then on to Chalcedon. These are the early church councils that kind of hammered out the points which would be counted as orthodoxy. And in Nicaea, the question is whether Christ is consubstantial with the Father. That is, in what way are God the Father and God the Son the same, and in what way are they distinct? Because, again, we're dealing here with something that is fundamentally one, like the circle made of bronze. God is one, and yet it's possible to, and it really is the fact that there's a distinction between the three persons of the Trinity. And so early church fathers and theologians were very, very concerned to hammer out in what way this is. And this developed over time into another conflict between Cyril of Alexandria and Nestorius. And you might have heard of the Nestorian heresy, which has to do with dividing the natures of Christ too exactly. So Christ is God and man, but he's God and man in sort of a similar way to the way that the circle is both bronze and a circle, that the manhood and the Godhead are supposed to be dwelling exactly in one, but they are distinct all the same. And that, squaring that circle, threading that needle, navigating that narrow path, or whatever, is kind of the point of Chalcedon, the Council of Chalcedon, and it's the point of a lot of other arguments, and it's where Aquinas begins when he's talking about what kind of latreia, what kind of worship is appropriate for Christ, specifically in his two natures. Whether you adore his flesh, his body, or just his soul, his spirit. And so he gets onto this thing about you are actually supposed to adore the whole Christ. And if Jesus, I mean, the practical implication of this is what would happen if Jesus walked into the room right now? And what would you do? Would you say a prayer to the presence of him? But would it not be fundamentally any different from this current moment when I'm speaking to you in this podcast? And I do believe that Jesus is with us through the Holy Spirit. So would it matter if he physically walked into the room? And Aquinas' answer is basically, yeah, you would fall to your knees and you would kiss the hem of his robe and you would do whatever else would be appropriate for worship. And here is why, because he says, obviously we don't worship or we don't honor a man who has done something good, like won a war. We don't honor his hand. In other words, we don't honor the part of him that he used to do the thing in the same way that we honor the man himself who was the agent of the act. And so we want to honor the totality, but we can respect the parts of him that have enabled him to do this thing in a manner befitting him. And honor in the human world is kind of the analog, the appropriate analog in human terms for worship in the Godhead and in divine terms. So, says Aquinas, to adore the flesh of Christ is nothing else than to adore the incarnate Word of God, just as to adore a king's robe is nothing else than to adore the king. So, this is really interesting because on one hand, Aquinas is making kind of an instrumental argument here, right? He's saying, how do you adore the king? How do you perform what the Greeks would call proskunesis, which is the adoration of a king? Well, you would kiss the hem of his robe. And so you're not worshiping the robe or you're not adoring the robe when you do that. What you're doing is you're adoring the king. But that's how you do it. That's what it looks like in our embodied world to worship or to adore the king. And since we want to worship only the heavenly king, when we ask about what we do, how we regard his physical person, we say, yeah, we are worshiping him. We're worshiping the Godhead that he is. But the point of incarnation is that since we are embodied souls, the only route for us to that worship is through some kind of embodied approach. And so we would kiss the hem of Jesus' garment because kissing the hem of the garment and kissing what the garment represents are one and the same thing. The kissing is just a medium, but the medium and the message are the same, as Marshall McLuhan would have reminded us. And so that's why I started by reading this passage from Faramir in the Two Towers. I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend. This is a famous quote. A lot of people have it on their Twitter bios or whatever. It's a great line. But the reason that Faramir needs to make that distinction is because loving the thing that he's defending looks like something in the world. It looks like the sword with its sharpness, and it looks like being a warrior and gaining glory and all of these things. And those things have an inherent satisfaction to them, which they derive from what they represent. And what they represent is something intangible, which is defense or honor or whatever. But it's the route to those things is only through the particular actions and activities. And so this is where that slippage between Latreia and Dulia can emerge. And this is effectively why the human heart is a factory of idols, is that because we are embodied souls, we're always tempted down into that direct worship of the thing itself, for itself, in itself, rather than as the vessel of something greater. We're always tempted to look at the human body as a cluster of cells rather than the spirit or the soul that cluster of cells it encapsulates and delivers. And we want to do that for power reasons, because we think it will make us powerful over the divine essence. And we want to do it because it's just part of our natures to be embodied souls. And therefore, it's really easy to get confused unless you are kind of constantly thinking about this stuff, caring about it. And if you think that you can get out of caring about it by not being religious, you're kidding yourself, because this is also the structure of many, many other errors in the secular world, like when we talk about a baby as a clump of cells, right? That error, although religious people are particularly attuned to it, is not a uniquely religious error. It's an error in idolatry. It's an error of confusing the matter, the vehicle, for the thing it's a vehicle of. And that slippage is why I think people get worried about the motion from Latreia to Dulia and vice versa. So maybe now you can start to see why, for me, from my perspective, both the Catholic position, which is obviously true, and the Protestant position, which I also think has a point and it has obvious truths in it, exist kind of in this dialogue that is there to show us the full truth, the fullness of the truth, which is both that these things are distinct, getting them confused is wrong, but there's also no avoiding the union between them. There's only understanding that and making these distinctions, because one of the things that Aquinas goes on to do is he makes distinctions between the way he says something really interesting, which is we're supposed to avoid the useless practices of the pagans, which is something that St. Paul says, but not their useful practices. And I've been kind of stressing this on the podcast lately, that the fact that we are supposed to reject paganism does not mean that we're supposed to reject all of the things that pagans did. It means we're supposed to siphon off from those things the part of them that was paganism. And you might compare this to the Hitler also wore shoes phenomenon. If you've been online at all, or even just read a newspaper, you've seen the endless Hitler comparisons that we're all addicted to. And now there's this kind of, what I think it was Leo Strauss, maybe it was Harry Jaffe, who called this reductio ad Hitlerum, which is where you just go so extreme with that you become absurd. And people will say, you know who else liked physical fitness? The Nazis. And it's like, right, okay, the bad part was that they were Nazis. The bad part was not physical fitness. And so using that as a cudgel to beat your enemies always becomes ridiculous because it fails to make this distinction. And you say, well, Hitler wore shoes too, and you're wearing shoes, so that's very suspicious. Or Hitler also, celebrated the nation, so patriotism is basically one step down the road to Nazism. And the answer to that is the same as the answer to this accusation of paganism, which is, yeah, the pagans did a lot of things. They ate food, they slaughtered animals, they did all sorts of activities that we also are gonna have to do. The question is, why did they do those things? In what way did they do those things? And what attitude can we siphon off and distinguish as wrong in those things? And Paul actually tells us, which it is, just taking the creature for the creator, that is, putting the creature in the place of the creator, which means confusing the vehicle, the fleshly vehicle, for the spirit that is encapsulated or communicated through it. So yes, if Jesus walks into the room, you fall down and worship him, but not because his fabric of his garment is so nice, although surely it will be. But the reason it'll be nice is because he's God, and that's why you're worshiping him. This is all very, very important. It actually touches on everything. It touches even on the part about language that I was saying earlier, that when we forget about the life that animates a word, then it starts to decay into a more pedestrian and mundane kind of dead metaphor. But when we recover the metaphor within it, then we find the life. That too is a feature of this conjunction between the spirit and the flesh, that they are inextricable. And there's no way for us to get out past or around one or the other. What does this have to do with the veneration of icons? Well, you can probably tell where I'm going with this, right? The reason that Aquinas needs to deal with this two natures thing first, which is this older question from Chalcedon, is because it speaks directly to what an icon is, and it speaks to why, in some sense, the world itself is an icon. And actually, you can kind of start with that, right? You can start with saying the world stands in for much more than the mere fact of itself, in the same way that Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce stand in for much more than football and pop music. And we react to them. We have an emotional response to them in that way. In that exact same way, the world is much more than atoms, even though it's made of atoms, or it's made of quarks, or it's made of whatever. Even though it is matter, it stands in for much more, and we emotionally react to it in that way. We don't just react to the world as if it were a blind collision of mindless atoms according to natural law. We react to it as if it were a painting, as if it were a sculpture, as if it were the greatest sculpture of all, and fills us with life and emotion and feeling. So the world is, in that sense, the world is an icon. The world is an image. The world communicates to us and is a vehicle. The flesh is a vehicle for more than itself. Now I want to read to you a passage, not from Aquinas, but from John of Damascus, who is the latest of what we call the Greek fathers. So in early patristic literature, that is the early church and the theologians that emerge in late antiquity and the early medieval era, you get the Greek and the Latin fathers, because this is where you're getting the distinction between the East and the West in what is basically the remnant of the Roman Empire. And in the West, you have a sort of fragmentation into multiple tribal states that will ultimately, under Charlemagne, be kind of unified by this fusion of papal power and secular power and the collaboration there. And in the East, you have something that looks a lot more like the continuation of the Roman Empire. That is, in Constantinople, which is Byzantium, but now it's Istanbul because they gave Constantinople the works, and why they did that is nobody's business but the Turks. Over there in Constantinople, you've got the continuation of the empire, which grows and shrinks and has all these fights, not only with the West, but also with the Turks and with the Bulgarians and yada yada, on and on. Anyway, this distinction is coming to be made, and it becomes, among other things, not just a religious distinction, not just a political distinction, but also a linguistic distinction. Initially, everybody's speaking Latin, but then nobody understands Latin, so why are they talking so funny? They have to start speaking other languages. And in the East, what they do is they start speaking Greek, and eventually the Greek East and the Latin West is going to be the distinction. And so you get these two different kind of strains of theology that also have different emphases, although, as I've been stressing, maybe not necessarily as distinct disagreements as we might imagine. So here's John of Damascus, mid-7th to mid-8th century. And he's also, interestingly, he's because he's the latest of the Greek fathers, he's also been viewed as the beginning of scholasticism, which is the medieval practice that Thomas Aquinas is part of this very rigorous, systematic theology. So he's been called the precursor to scholasticism or the first scholastic. Do with that what you will. Your mileage may vary. But the idea is we're kind of moving here into that kind of philosophy. And you can tell because his work, The Fountain of Wisdom, is kind of an attempt to be systematic. It contains these three different parts: philosophical chapters concerning heresy, and then the part I'm going to read to you from, which is an exact exposition of the Orthodox faith. And there's the scholastic spirit right there. Yeah, I'm going to be very precise about this and give you the point-by-point details. And it's a very useful work for that reason. So let me read to you now from Book 4, and it's chapter 16, I believe. Yeah, Book 4, chapter 16. And he's talking about icons. So already this is a concern, even though the real fight over this in the East that defines iconophilia as part of Orthodoxy is actually going to be 9th century, so slightly later. But here's what he says, and it's interesting how practical he is and how he has in mind. He's a shepherd of a flock, right? He's a pastor. He's thinking about how people relate. And one of the things he says is, in this kind of Platonic way, he says God is impossible to contemplate. Nobody can see God. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, and so on and so forth. Common refrain, not just among Christians, but among Neoplatonist philosophers. But God condescended to become incarnate, and there was this gate open in the heart of the world through the Spirit, through the flesh to the Spirit. This was our salvation, and then there had to be some way for people to encounter that, because Jesus was embodied in a certain time and place. But then you need to be able to meet him afterward. It was written down. Obviously, we have the Gospels, but, says John, a lot of people can't read, which was much more true then than it is now. And so the other mode that we have of getting this across is through imagery. But here's something really fascinating that he says. Often, doubtless, when we have not the Lord's passion in mind and see the image of Christ's crucifixion, his saving passion is brought back to remembrance, and we fall down and worship not the material, but that which is imaged, just as we do not worship the material of which the Gospels are made, nor the material of the cross, but that which these typify. For wherein does the cross that typifies the Lord differ from a cross that does not do so? Now, very important and interesting philosophical distinction. First thing he's saying is, this is basically the same as the book itself, the Gospels. When you revere the Gospels, that doesn't mean that you love the book, the paper that it's written on, or the ink that is used, but you do have an affection, actually, for those materials because they are the only vehicle for those words, and those words then communicate to you. So even if you want to say, as some people do, well, graven images are visual depictions, but I have words which are pure ideas. As a lover of words and as a passionate defender of the power of language, I have to break it to you that words are not pure ideas. They are physical vehicles for ideas. That they're ink, they're sounds, sound waves, they're paper, they're all of that stuff. And you would never think of that book as God. That would be closer, I think, to an Islamic position, that the book is God in librit. But the ideas in the book and the content in the language is the delivery system for God. And so you are going to love, just like you kiss the hem of the robe, you are going to love the book. And that's what John of Damascus is saying about the book. And then he says, by comparison, icons are exactly the same way. Images are exactly the same way. And sometimes those images typify what they depict, which means that they look like the thing that they stand in for. And this is a classic ancient distinction in the field of semiotics, which becomes actually only more important if you read modern semiotics. This still is urgent and matters. But there's a sign, if you think of like a sign that has a picture of a boy and his mother crossing the street, there's a symbol that represents by way of resemblance, and that's typifying. But then there's a symbol that does not resemble at all, like a sign that says XING. That doesn't even look like the word crossing, but we know that that's what it means. And so that is another way of representing without resembling. And he says, John of Damascus says, we have two kinds of image in the church that we venerate in this way. One is the typified image of Christ, and the other is the non-resembling, non-typifying image of the cross, which doesn't look like Jesus, but nevertheless calls Jesus to mind, or even stands in for Jesus in this, all these important, crucial ways. This is what goes on in the church as they're working out their theory of icons and how they should regard and deal with the icons. It is also how we should regard all art and all of life. And the question whether to worship or merely venerate or simply enjoy and respond well to something is just the question of art. It's what is the appropriate moral relationship and emotional relationship to the thing depicted by the world, by Taylor Swift, by a movie, by a picture of Jesus. And since we are embodied beings, that is the only question. There's no getting away into how are we going to do this pure Neoplatonic contemplation. Ain't going to happen. Like doesn't work except through this communion or direct encounter with the fleshly embodiment of things. And so we have to think about how to structure our embodied life and relationship, and also how to think and use our brains to make that relationship right and distinguish it from paganism, which falls, the definition now of paganism is going to become falling into the worship of the flesh rather than the thing for which the flesh is a vehicle. And this is kind of the distinction between spirit and flesh that Paul is constantly making. It's not a distinction between matter and form, because he could have just said that. It's not about body and soul even, because he just could have just said that. It's about whether you treat the soul as an illusion of the flesh, of the body, which is the flesh, right? Or whether you treat the body as a vehicle for the soul, which is the spirit. And the workings of the spirit are to treat your body that way. And I would argue that a spiritual relationship to art is when you treat art that way too, and your encounter with art as almost deep crying out to deep. It's almost you who are an image, who are a work of art, who are God's image, encountering another work of art, be it an emotional experience or a painting or an icon that you would venerate. I now want to read to you from a really lovely email that I got from an Orthodox listener. And this is Lincoln Brown. He's a writer. You find him at PJ Media. We've emailed a little bit, but he was struck by the Taylor Swift episode when I started talking about icons. And he said something really interesting. He said, the icons are not just for reverence, even while they have no salvific power themselves. They are also reminders or examples. If you look at an Orthodox icon of Christ, you will see that he has a look on his face that is both stern and compassionate. Incense not only blesses the space with the rising smoke representing our prayers, but it also involves the sense of smell. Okay, this is a really great point, and I'm going to add to you who have just added to me and say these are the same thing, or at least these things are fused together inseparably in the same way that a body and a soul are fused together, which hopefully now that I've read this Aquinas passage and the John of Damascus, you can see where I'm coming from with that. And also, perhaps you can see where I'm coming from when I say that all of the fighting over this, even though it has often become rancorous and been shameful and there have been terrible struggles in the church about it, I don't deny any of that, but you can still maybe see where I'm coming from when I say all of the fighting over this is part of the point. It's part of working out our salvation with fear and trembling. It's part of God's act through the church in the world that we would be having these disputes. And so one common accusation that is always made against the Christians by non-Christians, and this goes, again, way back, goes back to the pagans. The Greek pagans made this accusation. Now you will hear atheist Reddit bros online making this accusation. Well, they're always fighting. They can never agree. They don't know what they believe. They're constantly having these fights. My reaction to this is the Chad yes meme. My feeling is you can see how actually that is one of our strengths. Schism is not a strength. Fighting in public is not a strength. In fact, it's specifically advised against in the Bible. But dispute and disagreement over these points is actually a strength because the two sides of the argument turn out to be part of one and the same thing, just as body and soul turn out to be aspects of one and the same thing. And so I would say here that the reminder or example function of an icon that Lincoln is writing to me about is in some sense the same as the moral power of it, the way that it shapes your soul, because we have this moral reaction to art, this emotional reaction to art, since art is the vehicle for getting across the spirit. And to use an analogy, to give another example, I've been doing some words episodes, these episodes, shorter episodes that I do on Friday about translation. And one of the things I've been talking about a lot lately is register, tone, the tone of a piece of work. And one thing that I keep stressing is you actually can't change the register without changing the meaning. There's no such thing as going from, a Smash Mouth version of the Epic of Gilgamesh to the real Epic of Gilgamesh, because you've changed the tone, the register, and that the form, the material that you use to get it across is part of the content. This is true at every level of life, because life is relationship, because God himself is relationship, right? The Trinity is already in relationship before we even exist. So the question becomes, what do we do about it? And what do we do about the accusation that we're indulging in idolatry or whatever? I'll read you one more passage from C.S. Lewis. So we've had Tolkien and Lewis in this episode, as well as John of Damascus and St. Thomas Aquinas, and we will surely go on. I have another email that I want to read from a Catholic, and also I have other texts that I want to do about this, but we're running out of time for now, so I want to read this C.S. Lewis passage from The Problem of Pain. And he says, "We are afraid that heaven is a bribe, and that if we make it our goal, we shall no longer be disinterested. It is not so. Heaven offers nothing that a mercenary soul can desire. It is safe to tell the pure in heart that they shall see God, for only the pure in heart want to. There are rewards that do not sully motives. A man's love for a woman is not mercenary because he wants to marry her, nor is his love for poetry mercenary because he wants to read it, nor his love of exercise less disinterested because he wants to run and leap and walk. Love, by definition, seeks to enjoy its object." So I began this episode with that Faramir distinction between the sword and what you're using the sword for. And in that case, there actually is a distinction that we can think about, right? There's the city that you're defending, but then there's the sword through which you defend it. And you want to avoid loving the sword more than the city and enjoying war and violence so much that you forget the point of them is to end them. And so that distinction is good to think with because it's really clear cut and you can actually make that distinction. And there, I would say, rests the great Protestant truth, if I can put it so broadly and vaguely, that the great Protestant reminder is not to slip from the sword defending the city to the sword being an end unto itself. And that is really where the emphasis of many Protestant denominations lies. This C.S. Lewis passage, ironically, since he was a Protestant, is in some way a reminder of the great Catholic truth. Again, speaking very broadly, which is that when it comes to God and human beings and to a whole range of things that we might count actually as the highest things in the world, that distinction is only notional, the distinction between the thing and the fulfillment of the thing. People make this accusation all the time when you go to the gym, and you'll hear this still now, like, oh, you're just lifting weights because you want to be healthy. It's like, yeah, lifting weights is being healthy. And also, like, the thing itself is what I enjoy. I like going to the gym and lifting weights. That's something that I like in my life. And yeah, I like it because of all its positive benefits, but its positive benefits are the thing itself. I'm in love with this person and want to marry because that is enjoyment of the thing. If this is true of anything at all, it is certainly true of God, that he is sufficient to provide all joy. And so you're not trying to get at him because you want something else. You're trying to get at him because in him is everything. And this is also, I think, how we should regard not just the religious veneration of icons, but actually our entire right relationship to the material world, that we are always going to be trying to do particular things. We're always going to be trying to wake up an hour earlier. We're always going to be trying to get that extra dollar. We're always going to be trying to, get our kids into a good school, whatever. And it would be easy to accuse ourselves, and sometimes it's perhaps true, that we've forgotten the point of all those things. But the reality is that when we wake up to the truth of God embodied in the world, the truth of the incarnation, we will find that in those things is their point. And to make that flip, that shift of mindset out of paganism and into true latreia, true worship, and true dulia, true veneration, is the whole secret of life. So Wendy Williams to John of Damascus to C.S. Lewis, only on Young Heretics. There's more to say here. I'm gonna talk more about this, but I want to do a mailbag question because I have a really fun one today. So let's do that. When you want to ask me questions, and I don't doubt that this topic will generate some questions, first of all, let me reiterate, I'm not telling you how to worship. I'm not telling you what you need to think about this matter or whether your church is wrong or right. So please don't use me as a spiritual authority. I'm just delivering to you things from my life as a scholar that I think are really helpful and interesting, and that I hope you will find really helpful and interesting. But if you want to write in with questions, if you want to talk, go to my Substack at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. That's where I do my weekly newsletter. That's also where, if you would like to support me, you can, and I'd be very grateful. There's stuff that you'll get in exchange for that. I am recording this audiobook of Paradise Lost, which has been really fun. You can listen to me read Paradise Lost. You can listen to me talk about works of Christian mysticism. There's all sorts of stuff that you can get on there. And I should mention that we've been deep in the Christian weeds here, but I don't just write or think about Christianity. I also talk a lot about the Jerusalem and the Athens of the West. That is, Jerusalem being the theological part and Athens being the Greek and Roman philosophers. So we'll talk about that too on Rejoice Evermore. And you can write to me in the mailbag. So that's what Nathan has done here. And he's asking me about the three-body problem, which is this wild science fiction, modern science fiction series. And Nathan says he's been reading it and he's curious about my thoughts. Beyond loving science fiction, I am particularly interested in this series as a window into a Chinese perspective. of the world and conflict of particular interest to me as a military member facing the prospect of war in the Pacific in the near future. I find it peculiar that the author would portray the Cultural Revolution leading to a union of anti-human pro-environmentalism forces. It seems the described 400-year effort to prepare for war is parallel to the Chinese 100-year plan. There was also a particularly interesting line in the second book that casually equated Chinese military political officers to American military chaplains. This is a cynical take on the purpose of the chaplain corps. All right, I'm so glad to get to talk about the three-body problem, which I have right here behind me. This is one of those books, I always say God prepares my reading lists. Sometimes you happen on something and it just catches your eye and it keeps coming back to you and you can't look away. And this is not the kind of book that I would usually pick up, not least because it is very loudly endorsed by Barack Obama on the front cover. And I just thought, why am I interested in this book? It doesn't look like my thing. I'm not a huge sci-fi guy, although I like science fiction. This seems kind of involved and whatever, but it just kept hitting me when I was at Landmark Booksellers in here in Nashville, and I just picked it up. Let me check this out. So it's a work of Chinese science fiction. It's by Liu Xixin. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's the basic idea. And it is, to me, one of the most mind-blowing works of science fiction I have ever read. It's a trilogy. I'm only 2 books in, but it just keeps getting better and better. I haven't watched the adaptation on Netflix yet. I'm kind of scared to because I feel like they're going to mess it up, but whatever, we will see. If they do it like they did Foundation, I'm going to riot. I will actually be in the streets. But anyway, this is a side note. To your point about the religious element, the American military chaplains, yeah, I think Liu Xixin is he strikes me as a kind of dyed-in-the-wool secularist, and of the kind of hard-line, tough-minded, new atheist type almost. And I don't want to put words in his mouth, but if you read the afterword that he writes to the first book, The Three-Body Problem, you will hear him saying things like, the Big Bang is a more magisterial story than any creation myth or any religion. And so I suspect that this guy, that's who you're getting with this guy, which is one reason why it wasn't initially my jam. But one interesting feature of these sorts of folks who are just really into science, they just love the wonder of science and data, and they like facts, they like the real world more than they like what they consider sort of imaginary mumbo jumbo, is that they're not actually natural friends of Marxism or of the cultural left. Because if religion is to them kind of astral mumbo jumbo, then what's really astral mumbo jumbo is all the cockamamie theories of Marxist historicism and gender theory. And that's why there are so many kind of ex-leftists or old leftists and old feminists and so forth that are part of the anti-woke movement in America, because they think it's piffle. If you read this woman, Sierra Weir, she's a TikToker who talks a lot about transgenderism. She calls herself a gender atheist, meaning gender, as distinct from sex, is a religious concept. It's nowhere in the body, it's nowhere in evidence, and so don't force me into your religion. That's sort of her bag. And she's really smart. She writes a lot of hardline essays, and she writes The American Mind, which I also edit, so go check that out. But this is just to say, I think that's who you're getting with The Three-Body Problem as the author. But you're also getting this fabulous creativity, and you're also getting this guy who, therefore, takes a very, very jaundiced view of the Cultural Revolution. This is under Mao Zedong, 1966 to 79, this communist uprising revolution. And the book, The Three-Body Problem, which ultimately is going to be about kind of an alien society coming to Earth. I don't want to give too much away because there's a lot of sort of dramatic stuff that happens. But it opens, before anything else, with a scathing depiction of a cultural revolution uprising in which scientists are forced to recant their belief in, I think it's relativity, in Einsteinian relativity. And they're violently killed, violently attacked, and one of them is killed. And this is a real thing. The Soviet Union, when quantum physics first became known about, discovered, the Soviet Union, Soviet scientists refused to accept it because it was anti-revolutionary. And the reason for that is that the notion of history as a forward march that's determined to generate class struggle, that is always necessarily going to lead in one direction, is a notion based explicitly on evolution and classical physics, this early idea of classical physics that turned out to be wrong, that every particle in the universe has a knowable velocity and position at every time. They're all solid objects, and if you knew the trajectories of them, you would be able to predict the future. That's part of Soviet Marxism. And it's an article of faith and not actually a belief in science, which was shown when it turned out under Boltzmann and then with Max Planck and so forth, that these things aren't rigorously determinist, and there is chance in the universe, and there is such a thing as free will and all this stuff that kind of emerged gradually out of these studies. And that was rejected by the Soviets, and that's the impulse that the free body problem opens with and begins with. This was what really just absolutely grabbed me about the opening of the book, as I was like, wow, how did he write this in China? And it turns out that only the English language translation begins that way. Because in 2006, when the book was serialized in Science Fiction World in a periodical, the editors made Liu put that scene, that opening scene of how awful the Cultural Revolution was, into the middle of the book so that the censors wouldn't catch it, which is hilarious to me because it means that they're just not reading that carefully, and publishers know that. That's, to me, a fascinating window into what it's like to be an opponent of the regime within China in and of itself. But also it kind of set my hair on fire to think that that was what was going on. So the English language translation is actually the book as Liu intended it to be. And then it unfolds into, I think he's dealing with antinatalism and with the despair that sets in when you start to think that humanity is not a worthwhile thing on the world, or that it's all just a kind of, that the earth is doomed and all of this. And so, yeah, I do think he connects materialist determinism and Marxism, and then in turn connects that to this giant idea of humanity is a mistake and should be erased. And it's one of the best fictional attempts that I've ever read to deal with this new spirit of anti-humanism, post-humanism, antinatalism. That's why. And that's the kind of guy that you're getting, and that's, I think, his perspective is he's sort of like one of these gender-critical feminists or one of these hard-lined old, class Marxists that just thinks that both religion and new leftism are all hogwash. So you'll find stuff to disagree with. You'll also find stuff to agree with if you're like me and you don't think religion is hogwash, but you do think that the new left is hogwash. You will find a lot in there to agree with. Plus, it's just a rip-roaring good time. My dad also really liked this book. So I would say heartily go check it out. That's my take. Those are my thoughts on how the book works and what's so interesting about it. That's it from me this week. If you want to write in, go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Oh, I should also mention if you're watching me right now, you'll have noticed that I have a new hairstyle. I'm doing my hair differently. And so what I also want you to do is write in with feedback. Is this new hairstyle iconic, or should I go back to my old hairstyle? I have no sense of fashion, so I need you to please weigh in. And you can do that at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. Very important matter, almost as important as the sayings of Lady Marmalade. Rate this podcast, review it, share it, subscribe it. That's how I grow the show. Really would appreciate your support. It means the world to me, and I have so much fun. If you can't tell, this podcast is such a joy to do. I love speaking with you. I hope that you will continue on this journey with me by subscribing. Check out my book, How to Save the West, and catch you on the flip side. That's it from me this week. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.